Hello, World Civ class. Today is Monday, April the 5th, and we are going to have our unit test on World War One this Friday. So we've got a bit of territory to cover. So let's start. Let's get started, shall we? So we talked about the Western Front, which is what most people think of when they think of World War One, trench warfare between the British and French on one side and Belgians, and the Germans on the other. A long, slog it out, depressing, you know, bloodbath, mud bath, disease bath that lasted for 4 years. But on the Eastern Front, the Germans were faced with the Russians, who had lots of men, but the Russians were the Keystone Cops of World War One. They were just terrible. At the Battle of Tannenberg, which is the first battle, the Russians were thrown into full retreat with a loss of 30,000 dead Russians. Although Russians had better luck against the Austrians at first, the Austrians soon had them on the run and were chasing them, the Russians. I should write the Russians, out of Central Europe. Russia was a study in military incompetence, poorly led, poorly equipped, uncoordinated in their efforts. The Tsar eventually tried to take command of the Russian forces, which was not probably a mistake. It was a big mistake. I mean, because the man had never heard a shot or seen a shot fired in anger in his life, and here he's taking command of 1 million soldiers on the Eastern Front. The British tried to help the Russians by opening up a southern front in a place called Gallipoli. Don't need me here, thank you. Where is Gallipoli? Kind of hard to find on this map, but Gallipoli is, well, right here. There's a peninsula that sticks out into the Aegean Sea here. It's called Gallipoli. And the British Army decided that a way to take the pressure off Russia was to attack through here, causing the Austrians and the Ottomans to, take their attention away from Russia. That's a nice idea, except it was a disaster. As it says there, the Australians and the Canadians say Mel Gibson. Well, Mel Gibson's Australian, and they got their heads handed to them. Even though the Russians were incompetent, they did manage to keep the Germans tied down for 3 years, which kept them from throwing their full weight at the West. World War One was truly a world war, more so than any war before it, but it's going to be dwarfed by World War Two. Germany could hold the forces of Russia, Britain, and France to a stalemate in Europe, but could not protect its own colonies in Africa and Asia. And so, for 3.5 to 4 years in Europe, there was a stalemate going on, but all the German colonies in Africa and Asia were on their own, and they lost big time. Japan quickly seized the German possessions in China and the Pacific Islands, thinking that they would get to keep these after the war. Big mistake. Yeah, one of the causes that Japan got back into World War II was that they got cheated in World War One. The Japanese thought, we took these islands away from Germany, we get to keep them, right? I mean, that's what the British would do. But no, they didn't. German colonies in Africa quickly came under the control of the British Navy. Native colonies in Africa and India helped the British, as did the Vietnamese, hoping that at the peace conference they might achieve independence, like Gandhi, for example, and Ho Chi Minh. Now, hopefully you know who Gandhi is. Gandhi is the person who single-handedly ran the British out of India, and Ho Chi Minh was the founder of the Republic of Vietnam. All of the events that speeded the war's end was the U.S. joining on the side of the Allies. Why did the United States join on the side of the British, the French, and the Russians? Well, see, that's the thing. Everybody thinks that it was just a slam dunk. It was a quick decision. Oh, the United States is going to join the British, French because they're the good guys. Actually, that's not true. When the war began, like that little video we saw, when the war began, there was, you got to remember that 25% of the U.S. population is German. And, once again, um, if you had gone back in time and landed yourself in, for example, downtown Cincinnati prior to World War One, there's a good chance that you would have heard German spoken on the street. You would have seen German children going to German schools where German was taught, German civilians going to German churches. For example, in Covington, there was a large German population. In fact, I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with Covington, but one of the big landmarks in Covington is the Mother of God Church. It was built by Germans, and if you went there in 1912, you would hear a mass, church services said in German. But the British, by comparison, are not even number two. The Irish are. But here's the interesting thing, as it says there, in the turn of many 20th century America, many of the larger cities of the North and Midwest not only had German populations, but many had an entire enclave of cities like Milwaukee, cities like St. Louis, cities like Cleveland, Pittsburgh, high German concentrations. But also the home of German newspapers, German-only schools. I mean, where do you think Over the Rhine got its name? However, what eventually turned the U.S. tide of opinion against the Germans was this thing called unrestricted submarine warfare. Unrestricted submarine warfare simply means that the Germans would sink ships, that the Germans would sink ships without any warning. Now, so you're in the middle of the North Atlantic, and the submarines, without any warning of any kind, would simply either surface and fire, or would many times towards the end of the war, the Germans had developed technology to where they didn't even have to surface to fire a torpedo at a passing ship. Now you got to remember that these submarines, I mean, if you look, they're pretty small craft. They cannot take on advisors, or rather survivors. And so a ship that goes under the waves, they're just out there. These submarines would simply slink off into the depths. So, why did the Germans use submarines in such a manner? In the good old days. In the good old days, I used to have my World Civ students write a paragraph defending the Germans using submarines in unrestricted submarine warfare. I used to have my students take the side of the Germans. And you say, well, how do you do that? I mean, they were sinking these unarmed transport ships. The unarmed transport ships were going to the bottom of the Atlantic. Most of their crew and the passengers did not survive these incidents. How can that be defended? Well, there's an old saying, all's fair in love and war. And what does that mean? Well, it means exactly what it says. There's no such thing as cheating. All's fair in love and war. And Germany was at war with Great Britain. Now, and we talked about this before, the British blockaded Germany and kept the Germans from, hold it please, and we're back. But anyway, getting back to the matter at hand, the Germans were in literally a fight for their survival, as evidenced by this picture. Now, this is a picture, and I may have showed it to you before. I don't know. I've showed this class so many times. This is a picture taken in Munich, Germany in 1917. And look around all these people here. They are not beggars. They're not dressed in rags. These are middle-class individuals. And here you see them in a street, and these are hooves. Hoof, 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 hoof. These people are stripping the carcass of a dead horse, a horse that has died on the street, and for its meat. And the point of that picture is that the British blockade of Germany was so effective that no food was going into Germany. And so you had people doing this. So, yes. And so, getting back to my hand, Germany was starving. So, the Germans wanted the British to feel the same depravity, the same starvation that they were feeling. So, how do you do that? Well, the answer is you have to deny them imported materials. Of course, the Germans didn't have a navy that could do that, but they did have submarines. I mean, once again, it's kind of like you being in a fight with Chuck Norris. Of course, Chuck Norris is winning, right? And the fight's going on, and as the fight continues, you begin to realize, I'm going to die. Chuck Norris is going to kill me, and there's nothing I can do about it. But then suddenly, you say, wait a minute. I have a 357 Magnum in my back pocket. But if I pull out this weapon and shoot Chuck Norris dead, that'll be cheating. That's not fair. On the other hand, if I don't shoot Chuck Norris dead, I'm not going to live to see another sunrise. So what is the choice? And the Germans made the choice. Those submarines were their 357 Magnum. Now, one such incident was called the HMS Lusitania. The Lusitania was a cargo and transport ship that was traveling from New York. It was a British ship traveling from New York to Britain. The Lusitania got literally within the sight of the coast of Ireland. How about another pause, shall we? Didn't want that. And we pause. And we're back. I just added a documentary that we're going to see sometime during this class period. But anyway, there were some 1,500 lives lost. 150 of them were Americans. The ship went down in 18 minutes. I mean, the big question is, why did it go down so quickly? There is more than ample evidence to indicate that the Lusitania, a British ship, was breaking international law in that the ship not only carried passengers, but it also carried explosive munitions ordnance. And there's a belief that when that torpedo hit the side of the ship, it ignited that ordnance and ripped the ship in half. And so, yeah, that could be a reason. Could be that the British wanted the Americans into the war. Why did the Germans return to unrestricted submarine warfare? Because it's the Chuck Norris question. The British were winning and eating turkey and white bread, and the Germans were eating horses off a street. What was the Zimmerman note? Now, the Zimmerman note, yes, you got to keep stopping the class. The Zimmerman note was a letter. Time right there. The Zimmerman note was a letter from the German Foreign Minister, Alfred Zimmermann, to the President of Mexico. And the bottom line of it was that the Zimmerman note tried to get Mexico to jump into World War I if the United States jumped in. The deal was supposed to be that if the U.S. joins the war, and if Mexico then invades the United States from its southern border, that when Germany wins, that Mexico would be awarded, Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, California, Nevada, Utah, Colorado, Wyoming. In other words, all that land that the United States had bullied out of Mexico in the Mexican War. Yeah. And so, yeah, that was the Zimmerman note. And not only that, the British were quite clever. As it says there, who was it to? What did it promise? That's what it promised. Who found it? Actually, the British intercepted it. The British intercepted the Zimmermann note from the Germans, but then they held on to it. And when they released it, they didn't release it to the United States president. They did not release it to the Congress of the United States. They did not release it to any government institution. They released it to the press. And by giving it to the press, of course, the press just took it and put it on the front page of every newspaper, as we just saw. And in doing that, it made the people of the United States enraged. They all called or wrote or whatever their congressman. And so, yeah. But now the question here, was the Zimmermann note something special? Answer, not really. Countries back then were always seeking allies. President Wilson also did not like the idea that the United States, the world's greatest democracy, being allied with the Russians, a land of peasants and a czar. But then the Russians dropped out of the war and signed the Brest-Litovsk Treaty. So Russia surrendered to Germany and signed this treaty. And so, on April 2nd, 1917, President Wilson asked Congress for a declaration of war. All right, let's end there, shall we? And we'll pick it up tomorrow.